This is the Philosopher King, Bob Brenton. Today I'd like to comment on a recent podcast by Eric and Bret Weinstein. This was an excellent podcast. It's about 3 hours long. I'd like to take about 10 minutes of it or so and pull that out and comment on it a little bit. So the first clip here is only about 15 seconds or so, but it describes a little bit of how Eric is coming at the problem of reality. And then the later clips, he goes on to discuss his 14D omniverse, or observiverse, as it were. And I'd like to kind of lay it out, let him speak about it in his own words. And then I tried to draw it on the back of the board as much as I can, but then I want to also link that to some of the ideas that I've been thinking in the area of consciousness. So let's go with the first little clip.
What I was going to say is that I don't buy into what you probably believe about the world, which is I don't think that right now you and I are in 3 dimensions having a progressing conversation in a 4th called time.
Yeah.
So that there lays out the very basic of what's going on here. I also do not believe that we are existing in 3 dimensions, with a 4th called time and having conversations that way. It appears like that. I think that that's a part of the illusion of what's going on here. But Eric is coming at it from a different angle, from the mathematical angle. And so I'd like to use his words again to describe it from the mathematical side and then equate some of that to how I think about things. Okay, this next clip is about 3 minutes long. We're going to just let it run.
And it turns out that what is impossible in space is possible across time because time has an extra piece of information, which is, let's say we took you, me, Heather, and Pia. Be 4 of us in space. If you could morph me into you and you into Pia and Pia into Heather, you'd have a continuous variable that connects us. That's something that you have with one agent over time, many instances of time, rather than one instant of time and having many agents. So sometimes there's a false duality to this, sometimes there's a true duality, and yes, this is an absolutely interesting issue where people don't notice that there is that which works across these reflections and changes a variable and dualities and that which does not.
Okay, I completely lost what you were getting at when you had us transmuting into each other. I didn't get that part.
If we want to compare your tastes and whether you're better off in a future instant of time, given that you've changed your tastes over time, turns out that we have a way of doing that where the field thought that was impossible. If we want to compare a bunch of people's different tastes, you could do that if you had a morphing of me into you, you into somebody else into somebody else.
I see.
And therefore the idea is that with an extra piece of data, there would be a duality between time and space. But even the great Ken Arrow, arguably the greatest of mathematical economists of modern times, was fooled into thinking, you, Eric, cannot possibly be telling me that you guys have solved the problem of intertemporal tastes because that would imply a solution to interagent taste comparison, and I proved that that was impossible, therefore what you do is impossible. Then I had to say to him, nope, you've blown it. You didn't understand that there was an extra piece of data which made time different than space.
So am I right that this is a kludge? The thing about a kludge, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, kludge is basically an engineering term where a kludge is an inelegant but highly functional solution. Right?
What is a kludge? In this case?
In this case, the fact that you can use that, obviously there's nobody transmuting into anybody else, but if you treat somebody as transmuting into somebody else, you can apparently solve a problem that
you would be able, but then the solution would depend on the transmutation, and since that's not real, if you can't remove that dependence on that extra piece of structure that you've now invoked, so yes, the idea is that I can solve the Arrow impossibility theorem with an extra piece of data, which is a continuum that connects all members of the society together. Does that ever work out to be meaningful? I've never seen a meaningful example of it.
So this is actually one of the first places where I disagree a little bit with Eric and Bret. I do believe that there is this idea of transmutation, and I think that it's actually baked into our behavior patterns. An example of this is the idea of eating. So you eat the flesh of something else. So you are taking something that is an animal product or a plant product, and you're consuming it, and it becomes transmuted inside of you into something different. So we already have a physical analogy of this idea of transmutation, or people morphing into one another across time. It's not quite the same thing that they're talking about, but again, I want to play with this idea, riff with them, as Eric said to Bret here in just a moment. But I do think that it is something kind of baked into reality, this idea of transmutation, and even possibly this idea of transmutation across people. You see some of this also in religious context, in which I want to bring in a little bit more later, but the idea of reincarnation is a transmutation of essence across people. So this isn't, it's a foreign idea to mathematicians and those that have kind of grown up irreligious or not believing in any sort of faith or anything like that. But what I'm trying to do is actually merge those two worlds again, which is give a plausible explanation for God and those sorts of things, but approaching it from a scientific mathematical standpoint, and trying to show that we're looking at the same thing from two different angles. So in this next clip, Eric begins talking about the structure of this 14D observiverse. He uses the idea of a cylinder that has been cut in half, and that there's a band around this cylinder. I'm going to let him speak for himself here for the next couple of minutes.
So I would say that if you started off with an infinitely thin hairband, then for every point on that hairband, imagine the space of all possible things that you might call of unit length, all possible rulers.
Okay.
And allow that a ruler can be either marked with positive numbers or negative numbers for whatever reason.
Yep.
But you're not allowed to choose the zero ruler.
Positive.
There's no way in which you can claim that everything is
negative time,
of zero length or infinite length.
I don't understand what a zero ruler would be.
Let's not worry too much about it.
Okay.
What I would claim is that the object that I would create, if I did the same thing, which I'm doing to 4 dimensions, turning it into 14, would turn the hairband into 2 toilet paper cores, the cardboard cores, which would be 2 disconnected cylinders. And you could see that the circular nature of the hairband would be represented in the circular nature.
Okay, so I get it. So you take a band, let's imagine that this was done on the computer screen.
Right.
You've got a circle, right? This hairband of no dimension.
Right.
And you stretch it across something, that gives you a tube.
Well, what I would say is that along that tube is every possible, going lengthwise down the tube, is every possible ruler with the same sign. So the reason you have 2...
is because there's a positive and a negative.
There's a positive and a negative. That's why you have 2. So effectively, you took a long tube, you cut the middle part of the tube out, because that would be the degenerate metrics.
So is this, you can't have one tube that goes from positive through negative because of a divide by zero problem?
You can't have that, because then you would say that there are directions which can't be measured as having a non-zero weight, if you will, or length, or whatever you want to call it, relative to every possible thing. So every possible measurement could yield 0 if you choose a degenerate symmetric 2 tensor. So remember, things can only serve as rulers and protractors if they aren't pathological. So all we're doing is getting rid of the stuff that is pathological and saying, I'm sorry that there was a little bit of fly in your soup, sir. We've removed all the flies from you.
I still want to know, when you say pathological, 0 is weirdly pathological. You can't divide by 0 or you'll blow your computer up, right? So there's a problem with 0 that doesn't tell you anything about immediately adjacent space.
We don't know of any way of handling the case where the rulers and protractors are effectively going to return 0 for certain directions in all circumstances.
So you're better off just saying, look, we can deal with this toilet paper tube and we can deal with that toilet paper tube, and they don't connect, but that's okay, because, okay, got it.
So now, if we took the hairband and then we said, you know what, let's up our game a little bit, because the hairband, there's no space. It's either all space or all time, depending upon whether you chose the plus rulers or the minus rulers. If you chose the minus rulers, it's all time. If you chose the plus rulers, it's all space.
Okay, wait, you're blowing my mind. Stop it. Why would the sign, is that arbitrary?
Sort of.
Okay.
Yeah. So in other words, it doesn't tell you that space should be plus and time should be minus.
Then
it just tells you, I need some way of distinguishing some time from some space. And if you want to do everything backwards from my conventions, feel free to call space negative and time positive.
Got it.
And I believe that the East Coast and the West Coast of the U.S. chose different conventions in terms of the university department.
Oh, really?
I think there's an East.
Interesting.
This is a physics thing. Mathematicians almost never, we know about this stuff, but it's not our lifeblood. In general, we prefer everything to be all plus or all negative. Right? We would call that Riemannian geometry. We know about semi-Riemannian geometry, it's just not very important to us. It happens that the one case of geometry that's really important in the outside world, it's mixed, because it's one time and three space.
So are you telling me that mathematicians are forced?
All right, so we've already got the beginnings of what Eric is talking about here with his 4D observiverse. I'm going to jump ahead here a few more minutes and get another 2-3 minute slice here where he describes this a little bit more detail, and then also some of the questions that he talks about later. So I've got two more clips to go through, and we'll see what we come up with out the other side.
Turns out to be dependent on this.
So I was going to say, though, is that if you up the game and you say, okay, now I want to play with 2 dimensions, so I have one time dimension and one space dimension, at least that starts to sound like reality, because space and time are different.
Yep.
So then you'd be in a 2-dimensional world, and you'd have one ruler in the time dimension, one ruler in the space dimension. So think about a watch versus an actual ruler. And you'd have an angle between the two, which would be your protractor. So that'd be 3 pieces of extra data. And then if you threw out just the way you cut through that, like, let's say, paper towel core, to have your positive and your negative, now you've got 3 pieces of that 3-dimensional space of 2 rulers plus 1 protractor. And it looks like a giant butterfly. And it takes 3-dimensional space and it cuts out. It looks, or you know that thing jugglers use called a diablo, which is like
the bar.
It's a wheel on a string.
Oh yeah,
right. It's sort of the bad stuff now looks like kind of the beginning of a diablo, and so you have 3 sections. 2 in the wings, call it a butterfly, and then there's 1 that kind of goes around where the string would normally go on that kind of flywheel contraption. And those 3 things would be the 3 different possible signatures. 2 of time, none of space, 1 of time and 1 of space, 2 of space, none of time. So those are the 3 possible ways of dividing up 2 dimensions into space and time.
Okay. This is...
All right, so that was one of the last clips, but again, just trying to illustrate that I'm drawing what I think he's talking about when it comes down to these lower dimensions. When we go up to the 14-dimensional observiverse and the 4 dimensions that we inhabit that are kind of generated by this thing, it gets a little bit more complicated. I believe that Eric talks about it in terms of Hopf vibration. I don't know much about these things. I am not a mathematician. But I think I can, I try to find out information about this, and you'll see that there's actually a lot of similarities in the structure of this Hopf vibration that I'd like to show you here that kind of match up with this, but it just looks a lot more elegant. And this would be a higher dimensional structure. So you can see kind of this toroidal look to the Hopf vibration. And there's all kinds of really unique patterns that come out of this thing. Let it go a little bit faster here. I'd like to point out, interestingly enough, that a lot of these patterns are actually very reminiscent of psychedelic experiences, which I think is going to play in later here. I know that in the podcast that Eric and Bret were doing, that they did bring up psychedelics at one point. To me, that is actually a part of the key of all this, and should be an important area of exploration, especially for mathematicians and scientists in general. I understand that psychedelics are dealing with the mind, which is an inherently subjective thing, but I think that we do need to understand those. And I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about that later. So now we see what a Hopf vibration is like. They are absolutely gorgeous. The Hopf vibration, forgive me for saying that incorrectly, they're absolutely gorgeous, but they're amazing structures that, imagine, again, being an eye looking at this from all angles. That's how I view this thing, this band that Eric is talking about, is almost like each of us has a perspective on that. It's, he uses the example of a soccer pitch at one point, we each have a different perspective of the same thing going on, and it's kind of like this. We each have a different perspective. This band can move around longitudinally on these on the two tubes, so to speak, and those would distort the rulers or the perception that we're having at that time, but we are all linked together on this one band. So that is why we tend to share a universe. But again, if you were to accelerate faster and faster, then your experience of space and time would be distorted compared to my own, even though we are still inhabiting both together this thing called the eternal now. We both only have one subjective view of reality. There are going to be different subjective views, and we might disagree on how much time has passed or how much space has passed, but we always agree on this eternal now. All right. Okay, this is the last clip that I'm going to show from here before I begin talking a little bit about my own ideas and how that I think that they fold into what Eric and Bret are talking about here.
Well, it didn't. That's a process of unpacking the consequences of a very simple seeming initial object. I have an innocuous fertilized egg. What could it possibly become? Nobody would ever guess that it would become you.
Right.
From first principles.
Right.
So that was part of what I was trying to do with the theory of everything. Is there anything that unpacks into something that has the richness of our world? Is there anything with almost no evident structure whose consequence is us? Because there's tons of evident structure.
Okay, that's...
I absolutely love that quote, and I'll say it again here. Is there anything that unpacks into something that has the richness of our world? Is there anything with almost no evident structure whose consequence is us? Now, I believe that there is, and I believe that I can talk about it in a way that most people don't, but is also an inherently simple way to talk about it. And I believe I can talk about it in a way that people relate to experientially, even if they don't necessarily recognize what's going on. So that's going to be the second half of this, but let me get through the rest of his quote.
Beautiful. I've never heard you say that before, but it dovetails exactly.
Okay, so in this case, for example, that simple hairband where you shrink the radius of that little tube down to an infinitesimal amount, generates a paper towel core that falls into two pieces. Turning that into the analog of space-time is wrapping that hairband in some way around the towel core so that it goes around once.
Wait. You've lost me. The towel core, I thought,
is
was
the space
extension
of all rulers that could go at any point. So just move the bit of the hairband up to the...
if you put the hairband on the towel roll, then you could mark every space, and then you could move it up and down, and that would tell you which rulers.
And you could move it up over here and down over there, so it's got a big ruler at this point, a small...
Cool.
But the idea is that each point on the hairband only goes through one ruler, which is represented as
That's what he's talking about here, or what he's talking about here, I believe, and this is if I understand him correctly, this idea, again, that I just mentioned about, if you're traveling, approaching the speed of light, then that's like distorting this hairband in one direction, wherever your particular point is on that hairband, distorting it out in one direction or the other, so that you cover more space than you do time. But for the rest of us, we, in relationship to you, are having more time than space. However, the thing that we agree on, what the hairband is that eternal now that we are all experiencing. It is never any time other than now. Ideas about the future are projection, or thoughts about it. Ideas about the past are things that we assume that have happened, but it's always occurring as a memory in the eternal now. There never is another moment. So I would call that hairband now, and the distortions of it change relative to our experience in this universe.
Space of possible rulers.
Each point on the band intersects exactly one point on the tube.
1 point of the longitudinal lines on the tube. Every point in the hairband only goes through one line along the lengthwise direction of the tube.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's a choice of a particular ruler. The line along that tube is the choice of all possible rulers. So you can order any ruler you want from Amazon. We'll customize it.
Yep.
Okay, I want this ruler for this point, this ruler for that point.
Okay.
Okay? Now imagine that you had physics that was happening not on the hairband, but on the tube. And you could ask for the temperature gradient across the tube. Maybe part of the tube is warm, part of the tube is cold. And the only thing you're going to record is what the temperature was like at that point on the tube.
The instantaneous measure.
At that point that the hairband was around the tube.
Yep.
That is effectively the new use of the space-time metric. We knew about rulers, we knew about protractors, but we don't have a model in which that is a periscope importing information from the tube back to the hairband.
So the game then is, what is the minimally complex geometric structure that provides you enough richness that you can get to all of the states you need with a simple description of...
Sort of. Let me just test to see whether or not I understood you. In my case, what I would say is that the hairband has enough data. So the hairband is like the fertilized egg.
Yeah.
Has enough data to build the tube, which is, tell me about the space of all rulers I could have at every point on the hairband.
Yeah.
Measuring the tangent direction.
I would say this possibly a little bit different than Eric, but again, I'm coming at it from a different perspective. To me, every point on the hairband is a living being's perspective of what reality is. So I have a point on the hairband, Eric has a point on the hairband, Bret has a point on the hairband, cats, dogs, mites, bacteria, possibly viruses, I don't know. They all have points on the hairband, and it is our collective understanding of what the hairband is based on our collective experience is what defines what the tube is. Or vice versa, so it's the tube that is kind of seeing itself, so to speak.
Then on the hairband, now that the hairband has generated the paper towel core, now I do physics on the paper towel core, like it can have fields, effectively, stuff that roam around on the towel core that are natural for the towel core. And I say, well, can I perceive all of that? No, you can only perceive the part that's along the hairband.
So,
and then the idea is that we're fooled, in my story, into thinking that the physics is all happening along the hairband, which is, in our case, the four-dimensional world. But the physics is actually weirdly happening on this 14-dimensional auxiliary structure, which is the analog of the toilet paper or the paper towel core. And we're only sampling the part through the periscope of putting the hairband around at one particular latitude across those lines of longitude.
Now, in some sense, this is my worst nightmare, because I think you're telling me that this is a better version of many worlds. That the particular hairband that describes an interaction with the tube is like the one world in the many possibilities.
Well, if you wanted to go that direction,
I don't.
Many worlds is a very particular quantum mechanical concept due to, I guess, Everett was the popularizer of it. What I would say is, in an observerse, which is the structure that contains both the hairband and the paper towel core.
Yep.
I analogize that to being like you're going to attend a soccer game or a basketball game, and you have stands and you have the pitch. And so the stands are where you perceive what's going on in the pitch, and the pitch is like the towel core, the paper towel core, the cardboard, and the stands are like the hairband. And so you're only sampling some of what's going on from every particular, like you and I went to the same game, but we saw different things because you were seated on the floor and I'm up in the bleachers. And
that I get. The part of the many worlds thing that drives me insane that I want to make sure isn't lurking here. I mean, and if it is...
Well, I'm just trying to say that I don't see many universes, I see one observerse. And the one observerse is a more complicated or more rich structure. I don't want to say, because I don't think it's that difficult to understand. In which you would be confused if you thought, like, I'm the only person that exists and I happen to be sitting here in the stands and you saw that guy get pushed across the way. I said, I didn't see him get pushed. It was like, you have a different view of the action. You saw things I never saw. There's more going on than I could perceive in my seat.
I get that, and that I like that. You know, the game took place. There was one reality of the game, and there were an infinite number of possible edits based on where you were. There were an infinite number of places you could view
I like what
from.
you just said.
Okay.
I mean, that's what happened in the first Matrix movie, that they actually mocked it up in 3D, and then they only took one of the possible camera angles for the CGI scenes.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So the question, though, is, will your hypothesis in my world, theory in your world, will it rescue us from the idea that all of these things are happening, that every game took place and you just happened to be...
So the thing is that most of what you hear about, discussed by the 4 or 5 talking heads you may have heard of from physics, is that they keep trying to blow your mind with the same repetitive quantum mechanical stuff. So it's always about many worlds. It's about entanglement. It's about the collapse of the wave function, the Schrodinger's cat, blah, blah, blah. Let's not go there initially. Let's fix the geometry underneath both general relativity.
This is great. What I'm hoping, my prediction is that if you do that, if you fix the geometry, then many worlds goes away.
Well, because...
And I would agree with that. Yes, the many worlds hypothesis is almost unbelievable in that it supposes universes are branching off from one another at every different particle interaction that happens. And I think that the way that Eric is describing it here is probably a better way to go. In a moment, I would like to flip the board over and talk about some of the ideas more from a religious or spiritual aspect, that kind of angle. I know that Eric and Bret are probably going to disagree with me because it involves, the woo, so to speak. But I believe that if they take the time to actually listen to this, that there's probably something in there that they can glean out of it that will be of benefit to them in their various professions. So give me just a moment. Okay. So, thank you for coming back. The question here, again, I'm going to go back to the quote from Eric. Is there anything that unpacks into something that has the richness of our world? Is there anything with almost no evident structure whose consequence is us? And I believe so, and I want to talk about that, and I believe that the answer is consciousness itself. And so I'm going to use this little diagram here. It's a little mock-up of reality, and talk through that a little bit. So in our diagram here, we have a person. They are laying down, they are sleeping, and they are having a dream. Now this dream world comes up. It appears in their mind, in their consciousness. Now, the reason I want to start here at the dream world is because at this point, we all agree that there is no physical reality. It is something that is an internal, a purely mental process. There is not a pocket universe that spawns someplace that, with a new physical reality that happens. And yet, what we have is something that is believable as a physical reality. So this person that is sleeping, they usually get a perspective of another person in there, and they wake up and they're like, what is going on here? Now there will also often be other people having other perspectives. So again, we're developing this band that is creating the conical structure of this dream reality. Now the interesting thing here, so all of this new universe that has been created is purely mental. It is all part of this guy's sleeping consciousness. The consciousness generated it. Now, there are things that you can do in this universe. One of the things represented by this little mushroom here is you can become what's called a lucid dreamer. Usually there's some sort of a test that you can do in the universe, pull your finger, eat a mushroom, look in a mirror, whatever the case may be, and you can start having this weird experience where you identify both as a person in the dream and also sleeping consciousness dreaming it. So you've gained a transcendent view of what's going on here. So this is the union now of the conical sections of this 14D universe and the ribbon. They're the same thing. So when you take a substance, you realize, oh, I am both generating and experiencing at the same time this universe. Now, the hypothesis that I have, I call it the Fractal Consciousness Theory, is that consciousness is the only thing that we require once we understand what consciousness can do to generate our entire universe and everything in it, and do so out of nothing. So we already know this about our own consciousness. It can generate universes, it can stick people in universes, it does so in the blink of an eye, and then it immerses you in there. Typically, so we would describe this whole dream as you still have phenomena. So if you get punched in the dream, you still, quote unquote, feel it. So you're still having a phenomenal perception. There's a sense of amnesia that comes with it. So you don't necessarily recognize right away when you're dreaming that you are dreaming. You're just there. You're participating in the dream. Your consciousness, as it generates a world, also allows you to forget that, hey, there's this whole world out here, our consensus reality that we exist in. We recognize that the dream is an illusion. There is nothing actually physical to it. It is fully immersive, and I would say that it is fractal. So one of the things that I would like to point out about this is, and I'm giving you this in theological language, but this is just free as a part of adopting this sort of a concept. I have described the omni problems of God. Omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. There's nothing there other than your sleeping consciousness. So you are omniscient, you are omnipotent, all-powerful, because everything that happens, every breath you take, every experience you have is a result of your sleeping consciousness. There's nothing else there. So that's omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient. So yeah, everything again is kind of governed by this process. It is all a result of your sleeping consciousness. All right, so what do I mean by saying consciousness is fractal? Let's take that exact same thing that we know, that we experience, and again, I don't know what consciousness is. There isn't a way to describe it as an isness, but we can describe it as what it does. So we here laid out a description. It dreams, and it does so in this manner, and it creates a universe and then shoves you into it, and it gives you a perspective of it. And you can wake up and become lucid dreaming and experience both being in the dream and outside of the dream. You're omniscient, you're omnipotent, you're omnipresent, because all of it is consciousness, just to repeat all that. All right, well, if consciousness is a fractal, let us suppose now that this reality, this consensus reality, is a dream just like our dreams are a dream to us. Now, the thing that we are in relationship then with, we'll call that God. That is God consciousness. There is no physicalness to this. It is an incorporeal deal. There is a no-thingness to this. So there's not, there's no physical thing to this consciousness. But yet, we look at the observable universe, and it appears to have many of these same qualities to it, where it seems to spring in this big bang out of nothing in a fraction of a moment, and then it appears, and then at some point all kinds of perspectives, we'll call those life, appear into it. And not only that, but I would point to the question of psychedelics as kind of a reality check to our universe that shows us that we are indeed all consciousness and a part of this. And so in here I've drawn God as the consciousness outside of the blue circle, but it enters up through each of our beings as our mind. Like that is our connection to this conical universe, this consciousness thing going on, this 14-dimensional being or geometric structure, whatever you want to call it. And that beingness penetrates and causes in the same way that we cause and our consciousness penetrates our dreams, In the same way, God causes all of this to be. It's the same fractal pattern that is playing itself out. Now, because God is far more powerful than us, the weirdness that we experience in our dream is not the same thing that God presents to us. That's why we have what we would call the consensus reality. But this view of the world, though, it solves all the problems that Eric and Bret were talking about earlier. So this idea of people morphing into each other. Within the dream, no, we appear separate. Outside of the dream, we are all connected. Now, this is that ribbon that we're talking about. So obviously nobody is, quote unquote, transmuting into somebody else unless you take the idea of, again, like the eating as, as above, so to speak, so below. So this idea of all one, anything can become everything in this world. So we do eat and we have these sorts of functions where we are transmuting the material of the dream into new being. But on the outside, consciousness is just doing its thing. So it is all one thing and one perspective. Now again, you can take mushrooms, psychedelics, things like that, and what that does is it perturbs the consciousness of the being that is taking it. So if I try mushrooms, my consciousness gets perturbed. But instead of just destroying me, what happens is I start to go through this lucid dreaming waking up process where I'm like, oh, I'm starting to identify with more and more things. I feel as though I am one with everything and connected to everything. And so you begin to see the structure a little bit from a higher perspective, a more transcendent perspective. Many people have even talked about having the experience of no thing or the Godhead or divinity, all those sorts of things. And those are all rolled into it. So again, if Eric and Bret are serious about this, and I hope that they are, I think that they should really start exploring this realm of consciousness and its connection to God. Because again, I think that this model here of being within a dream of something divine, and then combine that with, say, the mathematical structure of Eric, that Eric is proposing, I think you're going to come up with something that is, we're looking at the same thing. For the mystic, for the religious person, they're trying to look at it from the perspective of consciousness and God. For the mathematician, they are looking at the dream, but they're looking out at the edges of the dream to try to understand it that way. Same with the various physicists, astrophysicists, stuff like that. They're looking again to the edges of the dream world, and whether it's quantum mechanics where we're running into issues, or Big Bang cosmology or whatever, you're getting trapped. You're running into the borders of this dream world, and those borders will collapse when you, quote unquote, wake up, which is an experience that you can have. It's a part of reality. You can go and have, take magic mushrooms is the easy way. I've actually written a document. I'm going to link it. I'm hoping that Bret and or Eric spend a few minutes. It's only 27 pages long, but it talks about mystical experiences and what they are and how to have one and what the ramifications of that are. To me, this whole realm of mind is something that has been ignored far too long, and I can't wait for modern science to pick up on it, because right now we are languishing in all these fields, and a lot of that has to do with this ignorance around mind, spirit, consciousness, that thing that we most fundamentally are. And I do think that it answers. Is there anything that unpacks into something that has the richness of our world? Yes, consciousness can do that. Is there anything with almost no evident structure whose consequence is us? And again, yes, I think consciousness can do that. And I point to our dreams, its ability to create worlds out of absolutely nothing and populate them as evidence that, yes, this thing actually exists, and it is the causal force behind everything that we see in our four-dimensional reality. I am going to point to one more person. Hold on here for just a second. I'd like to draw attention now to Theoria Apophasis' YouTube channel. He's a very odd guy. He's one of those curmudgeonly types that is willing to say the thing that is true, even going against the tide. I'm not sure that I agree with everything. The math that he uses is a little bit different, and again, beyond me. I am not a mathematician by trade. The highest I ever did was college calculus, and then I dropped out of that and became a history major. But in any case, he points to this toroidal structure as being the base piece of the universe. And so I will link to one of his documents in the description below, and hopefully this will help. Hopefully this will reach some ears, Eric and Bret. I want to hear your guys' discussion about this sort of stuff, and find those links between cosmology and faith. And because I believe that those links actually exist. And I believe that the key is consciousness, our conscious experience. And I believe that we're kind of talking about the same structures from two different angles. In any case, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And feel free to like, subscribe, leave a comment, whatever. I appreciate your... Bye.